For today's video, we are going to be talking about the Kinderhook plates. So let's jump right in. So to start off, what are the Kinderhook plates? So the Kinderhook plates, they are essentially a set of 6 small plates. They're about 3 inches long that are bell-shaped, and they had characters engraved on them that a group of 3 men, whose last names were Fugit, Wiley, and Witten, they forged these plates and then they buried them in a hill near Kinderhook, Illinois. And so you can see on this map here, I've illuminated Kinderhook and Nauvoo, so you can see Kinderhook was relatively close to Nauvoo, which is where the saints were at this time period. And so after these 3 men had forged these plates and buried them in the ground, the following day they excavated them with several men who weren't aware that the plates were forgeries, and all of this was done in the spring of 1843. And so here on the right-hand side, I have a picture of the plates. This is a facsimile that comes from the Nauvoo Neighbor, which was a newspaper in Nauvoo at the time. It was not run by members of the church, but it was friendly to the church, hence the title Nauvoo Neighbor. And so in 1843, when the plates were first unearthed, this was printed in the spring issue. So as you can see from this picture, the plates are covered with symbols that look ancient. And so one of the members in the group who excavated these plates thought that these should be taken to Joseph Smith. Maybe he could translate the characters on these plates. Um, and, based on the accounts that we have, it seems that Joseph Smith and the saints in Nauvoo were pretty excited about this new record that had been uncovered. And so after the plates were unearthed, they were taken to Joseph, and he had them in his possession for about 5 days. And unfortunately, Joseph was not the best journaler. He hated writing and usually had his scribes write his journals for him. And so his journal entry doesn't really tell us very much about what happened. When the plates were brought to him, all his journal says is May 7th, Sunday, 1843, forenoon, visited by several gentlemen concerning the plates which were dug out of a mound near Quincy, sent by William Smith to the Office for Hebrew Bible and Lexicon. So that's all that Joseph Smith's journal says. So if we want to kind of get a fuller picture of what took place, we have to turn to other sources. And there are several other sources that we could talk about, but for our purposes, I think the best one is William Clayton's journal. And so in Clayton's journal, he says that Joseph said that the plates contain the history of the person with whom they were found, and he was a descendant of Ham through the loins of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and that he received his kingdom from the ruler of heaven and earth. And I should probably say at this point, because I forgot to earlier, that when the plates were buried in the ground by the conspirators, they also put some animal bones in the ground as well to make it look like they had been buried with someone. So when the plates were unearthed, people thought that they were unearthed with a human skeleton. So that's where this mention of the person with whom the plates were found, that's where that comes from. So this is William Clayton's record of what Joseph supposedly said about the plates. And this is seemingly a little bit problematic because it later turned out that the plates were forgeries, as I alluded to earlier. And so oftentimes critics will mock Joseph because he supposedly translated fake plates. And so the question is this really what happened? And so that's what I want to dive into a little bit more in depth. So the first question that we should ask is, how do we know that the plates are fake? Well, one of the reasons that we know that the plates are fake is because Wilburn Fugit, one of the conspirators, admitted that they were fakes. And he did this in 1879 in a letter that he wrote. He admitted that he, Wiley, and a local blacksmith, they forged the plates, they corroded them to make them look old, and then they buried them in the hill the night before and then brought people by the next day to uncover the plates. And in his letter, Fugit says that the reason why they chose to fabricate the plates was as a prank or a joke. And interestingly, it seems like, at least according to Fugit, he was inspired by a missionary tract called The Voice of Warning, which was published by Parley P. Pratt in 1837. And in this tract, it says, "Truth is yet to spring out of the earth." And so it seems like Fugit thought to himself, well, we could fabricate this truth springing out of the earth as a joke or as a prank. So I find this kind of interesting. That's where they got the inspiration for this idea from. And aside from Fugit admitting that the plates were forgeries, in 1980 there was a chemical and metallurgical analysis which was done with the one plate that we still had. The other five were lost, but we still had one. And so there was testing done on this plate, and it confirmed that the plate was not of ancient origin. There were several problems with the idea that the plates are ancient, one of them being that they were made of a modern metal alloy. It did not contain the level of impurities that we would expect to see that would be consistent with ancient metal. So that's two reasons right there. And then additionally, the plates, the characters that were engraved on them, they were actually not etched, which is what we would expect if they were of ancient origin. Instead, they were etched with nitric acid. So, excuse me, I should have said they were not engraved with a tool, but they were etched with acid. And so, when they did the chemical analysis, they found trace elements of the nitric acid left over. And so, that would also be consistent with modern origin because they weren't etching things with acid um, in any relevant time period that would be consistent with the idea that these plates are of ancient origins. And then finally, one other indication that the plates are fake is that the characters on the plates, they don't match any known language, and they don't have any of the patterns or groupings that would be consistent with the language. So yeah, all indication would be that the characters were just made up. And so now we have to ask, if the plates are fake, then where did the interpretation of the plates come from? And so, based on the evidence we have, it would seem that Joseph did not try to produce a revelatory translation similar to what he did for the plates from which the Book of Mormon came. Instead, it seems that Joseph compared the Kinderhook plates to some other ancient artifacts that he had in his possession already, specifically some Egyptian papyri that he had previously bought from Michael Chandler. And so when comparing the Kinderhook plates to the papyri, one of the symbols on the plates actually closely matched a symbol from the Egyptian papyri. And so what this would indicate is that Joseph Smith, rather than through divine inspiration, translated these plates, instead, it would seem that his translation came from him comparing a character on the Kinderhook plates to what's called the Gale, the grammar and alphabet of the Egyptian language. And the Gale was essentially a language project by some men in Kirtland, such as W. W. Phelps and Joseph Smith and a few others, who are interested in basically reverse engineering the Egyptian language, trying to see if they could crack the Egyptian language, because this was prior to the discovery of the Rosetta Stone. And so, as I mentioned before, one of the characters on the plates matched a character on the Gale, and we know this because they're both boat-shaped, and I have an illustration here, a graphic that helps um, demonstrate this. So if you look on the right-hand side, there is an image that was taken from a scan of the Gale, and you can see in the left-hand column there's this boat-shaped character, which is then expanded, and there's an explanation written next to it, and it's kind of hard to read, so it's been reproduced down below. And then also on the left-hand side, you can see one of the plates. There's a very similar looking character, and so if we compare the two characters and the explanations given for both of them from Clayton's journal and from the Gale, what we notice is that the interpretations match very well. Um, Everything that William Clayton said, Joseph said about the plate matches with the explanation that we have from the Gale. You can see down at the bottom here, we have the text of William Clayton's journal again, and he mentions the idea that the person to whom these plates belonged, He was a descendant of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And then similarly, we see that the explanation for the Gale character references kingly birth by the line of Pharaoh. And then we see from William Clayton's journal, there's a reference to the ruler of heaven and earth. And then similarly from the Gale, we see possessor of heaven and earth. And so the two interpretations match very closely, as you can see. And I'll just make a note, because some people have pointed out that the character from the Kinderhook plates does not perfectly match the character from the Gale, because there are some other elements to the character. And I think it's just worth pointing out that Joseph Smith and the other people who were engaged in the Kirtland Egyptian Papers project, they had the understanding that you could actually disassemble Egyptian characters. You could take them apart, and that individual pieces of the characters would have meanings of their own. So it actually makes a lot of sense that Joseph would see, oh, well, if you look at part of this character, it looks like a boat, and then it matches very well the character from the Gale. So that seems fairly consistent. And to corroborate the idea that Joseph Smith used the Gale as opposed to Revelation in his translation, we have this very interesting letter, which was sent in to the New York Herald. The person who sent it in, they did not use their real name, so they signed as a Gentile. But research has revealed that the person who referred to themselves as a Gentile, we know who this person was. His name was Sylvester Emmons. He lived in Nauvoo. He was not a member of the church, but he was very friendly to the church. And so I have here an excerpt from the letter that he wrote, and he said, "The plates are evidently brass and are covered on both sides with hieroglyphics. They were brought up and shown to Joseph Smith. He compared them in my presence with his Egyptian alphabet, and they are evidently the same characters. He therefore will be able to decipher them." So this uh, first-hand account from this man, Sylvester Emmons, would seem to support the idea that Joseph Smith used the Gale rather than Revelation to translate the Kinderhook plates. And I think it is also important for us to point out that after Joseph compared the one character to the Gale, the one character that we referenced before, he then said that he would like to authenticate the plates with an expert before he did anything else with them. And at this point, the owners of the plates actually took them back. Apparently, they weren't too keen on this idea, and Joseph never followed up with them again, and there was no mention in any of Joseph's journals or any other church records of anything else ever being done with the plates. And I think, we should point out, after this, supposed translation, none of Joseph Smith's critics, none of the men who were involved in this hoax, they never came out to expose Joseph Smith. And you would think that if Joseph had stepped into their trap, that they would have been, very quick to come forward and say, "Oh, look, Joseph put forth this false translation." But that's not what we see happening. And so this would seem to suggest that the men who fabricated the plates were disappointed that their joke, their hoax, was unsuccessful. And so the question could be asked, did Joseph use Revelation? Did he use a seer stone? Did he use the Urim and Thummim to translate the Kinderhook plates? And I think the evidence pretty strongly supports the conclusion that he probably did not. There's not really any good evidence showing that Joseph sought revelation. There is one source that, if you look at it, could hypothetically refer to Joseph Smith receiving revelation, but it comes from a source that's pretty antagonistic to the church, and you kind of have to squint at it to make it seem that way. So I don't think that is very strong data. All the data that we do have that is reliable would seem to indicate that Joseph used the Gale, and it's pretty cut and dry. So I think it's far more likely that Joseph went for a secular translation. I will say it is possible that Joseph looked at the plates and he tried to translate them through Revelation like he did with the Book of Mormon, and then perhaps he had some stupor of thought, as is described in the Doctrine and Covenants, and then he quickly lost interest and moved on to other things. I suppose you could think that if you want, but again, there's really not any solid evidence for that, but everyone is, of course, free to have their own opinion. And just going along with this idea of divine revelation, should the Holy Ghost have warned Joseph that the plates were fake? I mean, maybe. It kind of seems like maybe he was warned because Joseph doesn't really do anything with the plates after that initial 5 days where he studies them and says he wants to get them authenticated. So it's possible Joseph was warned, and that's why Joseph let the matter drop, or maybe God just let Joseph figure this out on his own. And then one other thing that we should probably address real quick is some people have pointed out that the history of the church does have a statement that sounds like it comes from Joseph Smith that says, I have translated a portion of them. And so we should probably talk about this. Uh, from the evidence that we have, it would seem that this actually comes from the excerpt that we looked at earlier from William Clayton's journal. We have great evidence that when a history of Joseph Smith, later the history of the church, was written, they compiled many different sources, and most of them were not firsthand accounts from Joseph Smith, but what they would do is they would put these accounts together to form a history about Joseph Smith's life that was quote unquote in his own words. And this was fairly common practice at the time period. Um, Biographers, they would compile documents and then they would have a narrative format to their biography, and it would be told in the first person as though the individual were relating these events. And so it makes perfect sense then that if we look at the Clayton Journal, um, when he says President Joseph has translated a portion, that would be changed to I have translated a portion, as though Joseph was speaking. Now, obviously, we would not engage in this kind of practice today. We would consider this to be bad history, but this is how they did things at the time. And just as a matter of interest, people might be curious to know what happened to the plates after Joseph examined them and then returned them to the forgers, the owners. And from what we can tell, after 1843, the plates bounced around for a while until eventually one of them ended up at the Chicago Historical Society. And the Chicago Historical Society acquired the plate in 1920. The other 5 plates are lost. We don't know where they are. Maybe they still exist, but there's a distinct possibility that they have been destroyed. They're no longer in existence, which in my view is pretty unfortunate. I think it'd be kind of cool if we had them. And some people have pointed out that the church, even after Fugit's letter was revealed in which he announced that the plates were a hoax, that the church continued to believe that the plates were authentic up until the 1980 analysis. And yeah, it is true. The church did think that the plates were authentic, and I think that is a reasonable position for them to have held. I think they were under the impression that Fugit was trying to discredit the plates by making up a story about him having forged them to try and remove evidence that church members were holding up, that people were writing records on metal plates. So I could see why the church would be reluctant to let go of this idea. But once the analysis that I mentioned earlier was conducted in 1980 that showed that the plates were a fraud, the following year, in 1981, the church put out in the Ensign an article by Stanley B. Kimball, in which they went through the results of the analysis, and the church said, yep, the plates are fake. We have changed our position to be more in line with the evidence that we have. And so that is all I have for you. Here are my sources. If you have any questions for me, feel free to include them in the comments section below, or if you have any feedback, just let me know. I'm, of course, always happy to dialogue. I hope this was helpful, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.